Okay, so we're looking at accounting for wages. First item we're going to look at is overtime, right? We all know what overtime is. When you work extra hours than your usual hours, you need to be compensated for those extra hours you worked, all right? And that is your overtime. Okay, so there are two ways you can calculate it, right? You can break down the overtime into two parts. Okay, the normal pay. Basically, here with the normal pay, what you're just doing is you're multiplying your overtime hours times the normal hourly rate. Okay, the overtime hours times the normal hourly rate. And then the second part is the overtime premium. Okay, which is more like the additional amount paid. All right. So now with the premium, okay, again it's the overtime hours times the normal rate times the overtime rate. All right. So sometimes they'll tell you time and a half, time and a third. Okay. Yes. So this is the first way where you break the overtime into its two components. The other way you can calculate it, you just get the total overtime pay. Okay. Where it's just the overtime hours times the normal rate times the overtime rate multiply. Okay. This, when you use this formula, both of these components are included in this formula. All right. So you can either break down the overtime into two components or you can just calculate the overall overtime pay. Okay. So I'm going to show you an example to illustrate what I mean here. Okay. We've got a worker. Okay. His basic pay is 10 kwacha per hour. His overtime hours, 7 hours. Okay. Overtime is paid at time plus a half or time and a half. All right. So we need to calculate the overtime pay for this person. For firstly, we can break it into the components. All right. First, we can get the normal pay part. All right. Where we say our overtime hours times the normal rate. You worked 7 hours overtime. The normal rate is 10 kwacha. So it is 70 kwacha here. Okay. That's the basic pay part of the overtime. All right. Then you can get the overtime premium, which is the overtime hours times the overtime rate. Now I want you to take note of one thing, colleagues. When you break the overtime into components, this overtime rate, if it says time and a half, you're just going to use only half. Okay, you're not going to use one and a half. The one and a half, you're going to use it if you want to just calculate the overall overtime pay in the second formula. But here, we're just going to get the half part for the premium. Okay. So this is the overtime rate, which we said in this formula here. This overtime rate, which can be zero point 0.5 or half, times the normal rate. So we're going to say 7 times a half, that is 3.5. 3.5 times 10, 35 kwacha. So that's the overtime premium. So 70 plus 30 kwacha, you get 105 kwacha. That is the first way where we break the overtime into its components, the basic part of the overtime and the overtime premium. Now, the second way where we just get the overall overtime pay, we're not breaking it into components, we're just getting the overall pay. All right. Remember, we said the overtime hours times the normal rate times the overtime multiplier. So since it said time and a half, so this 1.5 represents 1.5. Okay, 1.5. Okay, so you're going to say 7 times 10, that is 70. 70 times 1.5, you get 105. Any questions?